Welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report, our region's longest-running public affairs program. Lawmakers from northeastern Minnesota are joining us today for a recap of the week's activities at the state capitol. This is your opportunity to call or email your legislative questions and have them answered live on the air. Minnesota Legislative Report starts now.
Hello and welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report. I'm your host, Tony Sertich. Just over 2 weeks are left for our state legislators to work through their remaining issues at the Capitol. As the door starts closing on this session, what are the biggest issues remaining? Tonight, you can join the conversation. Email or call in with your questions for the lawmakers that represent you. To ask a question, dial the phone number on your screen, or you can email your questions to ask@pbsnorth.org. Joining us in studio today is Senator Jennifer McEwen, a DFLer from Duluth representing District 8. Welcome, Senator McEwen. Great to have you back.
Thank you very much for having me.
Alrighty. So we always start out with the big question. This is the second year of a biennium. Every 2 years, the first year, the legislature focuses primarily on a 2-year budget.
Yep.
That was last year.
Yep.
This year, traditionally, is a year for a capital investment or bonding bill where the state borrows money at a reduced interest rate to fund projects, capital projects, all across the state of Minnesota with state and regional significance.
Yes.
So with a little over 2 weeks left, where are we at, big picture on the bonding bill, and then we'll talk about specifics.
That's an excellent question, and I think that in regard to what the status is of the bonding bill, we have a lot of moving parts right now at the legislature in terms of whether or not we're going to see that bonding bill get over the finish line. And a lot of that has to do with the politics at the Capitol. As we know, we have an election year coming up. People are keeping their cards pretty close to their chest, I think. Last I had heard in the Senate, the Republican caucus was not even wanting to talk about a bonding bill with our Senate bonding chair. And I think that had to do with some of the politics that was happening. But at the same time, we know that bonding bills are very, very important to the people of Minnesota, to our infrastructure, to our very, very basic infrastructure in our state, to keeping it up, to maintaining it, to moving forward with important new projects that people bring to us at the legislature. And so I am hopeful that at the end of the day, after these 2 weeks, as we move through these last 2 weeks, that my Republican colleagues will be willing to sit down. They will bring their list, hopefully, of already projects that they are hoping to also have funded in their districts and be ready to produce the votes to pass a solid bonding bill for this year. I'm hopeful.
And traditionally, this is the last bill that gets passed anyways.
Yeah.
And so there's no surprise sitting here 2 weeks out that it's not done.
It's not solid yet.
No.
Yes.
Governor Walz started first with his list of projects. They're primarily statewide upkeep on different entities, including our public colleges and universities. We've had Republican legislators in these seats in prior weeks from all over the Northland, generally supportive of a capital investment bill with some of their list of projects. Do you have specific projects you'd like to see included in this final package?
Yes, I do. Well, I would start out by saying that we have a number of projects that Duluthians have brought forward to us. Those range everything from funding to improve some of our water infrastructure intake, the intake of water from Lake Superior and the filtering of water and preparing it for the public, funding for the Duluth Aerial Lift Bridge, funding for a new tower at the airport, funding for the depot, funding for the deck. All of these different basic pieces of infrastructure in our region have projects that need doing. And some of them are very important projects that have been sort of waiting in the queue in line for a number of years, hoping to get that funding so that they can proceed with the projects. And so we're going to do our best. We're being, told by leadership and by the chairs to sort of keep our expectations tight and not get too grandiose. We're going to see something much smaller than we have seen last year, for example. Just the amount of resources that we have available to us to work with is much smaller this year. But that said, I am still hopeful that we're going to get our share of the pie, and hopefully we'll be able to move forward with a couple of those pieces.
The number that I'm hearing, at least, is somewhere just south of $1 billion potentially for a bill, and there was $7 billion of requests.
Yes,
and so
that's correct.
Many more requests than
more requests than money available.
So take us inside as a legislator. So part of your job is to vote on a final package that needs bipartisan support, because when you borrow money, the state borrows money, it takes a supermajority actually to pass that bill. So it's going to take Democrats and Republicans working together across the aisle, and then the House and the Senate working together as well. Right. So you're going to be voting on this bill, and you're also advocating for projects specifically for your region. Yes. So how does that work? How do you lobby for your projects? How do you make sure that you get your fair share and northeastern Minnesota gets its fair share in a final product?
Well, the regionality that you are talking about right now can help us in some ways. I'm hopeful that part of what we do at the Capitol is work as a delegation somewhat from our region. So for example, the airport, we have some major work that has to happen at the airport, but of course our airport here doesn't just serve Duluthians, it serves our entire region of northeast Minnesota and northwest Wisconsin as well, but it's a very large region that it serves. So all of us can and do, I think, talk to the chairs, talk about the importance of this project for our region, ask if the chairs will be able to carve out some of those resources for the things that we need regionally.
Great. And if local folks or folks from northeastern Minnesota want to be involved in this process to encourage their favorite projects that they might know about, how best to go about advocating on their behalf?
That's an excellent question, and I would very much encourage people to reach out to their representative, to their state representatives, and to their state senators, as well as the Walz administration, but certainly your representatives and your senators at the state level. They're going to be making this decision to move forward with this bonding bill or not. And in particular, if you are represented by a representative or a senator who is in the minority, so is a Republican member, they especially need to hear from you if there are projects that are very important that you want to see receive some funding, because they're the ones who really hold the keys to whether or not we're going to be able to pass a bonding bill this year. And them knowing that they have constituents who are saying, yes, I want you to do this, I want you to work in bipartisanship with your colleagues across the aisle to get us this funding for this bonding bill, that encouragement could really, really go a long way.
So last question on this for now. I've asked everybody sitting at this table their thought on the likelihood of getting something passed, a capital investment bill at the end of the day. Where are you sitting on this? How likely do you think that's going to happen?
I think that we have a pretty good chance of getting it across the finish line. But it's hard to say, honestly, I've been in the Senate now for 3 years. This is now my fourth term, or my fourth spring in the legislature, and each one has been so different, and there are a number of factors that come into play, sometimes things that I'm over time have just learned about. It would be fresh things happening each time depending on the balance of the legislature, the different political issues that are at play. So I am hopeful that my colleagues across the aisle also want to see this bonding bill realized. There are a number of needs throughout the state and in all areas of the state, areas that are represented by DFLers and areas that are represented by Republicans. And at the end of the day, I am hopeful, and I want to lean into that sense of hope that we will be able to, at the very least, come together with that supermajority to pass a bonding bill.
Great. When I said that was the last question on the topic, a viewer wrote in already. Sure. So thank you, viewer from Renshaw, who wants to know if it matters or not if a bonding bill is even passed. And so can you talk about that from two perspectives? Yeah. Legally, are you required to pass a bonding bill? And does it matter or not if the bill gets passed?
Thank you for that question. And it could be that there would be no bonding bill. That has happened in the past. That has happened in the past. And actually, there have been stretches of time in the not too distant past where we didn't have bonding bills, or we didn't have sufficient investment through the bonding bills. And so that can happen. That absolutely could be that there would be no bonding bill. And the problem with that, of course, is that these basic infrastructure pieces in our state, everything from our water resources, drinking water, our sewer systems, our buildings, our public buildings, and the buildings owned, for example, in Duluth here, we have the historic depot. We have the deck that are hugely important to our region as public resources. Think of all of the events that happen at the deck. So that deck needs upkeep. It needs upkeep in terms of roof repair. It needs upkeep in terms of the systems that they use for the ice rinks. And the list goes on and on. There are a number of things that if we don't fund those, we might be able to get by for a year, a 2 year, like how long do we go before those basic upkeep issues cause real problems in terms of our public facilities actually being able to do the job that we need them to do, which is, for example, in the deck here in Duluth, hosting all of these events that bring all of this economic activity into our region and a lot of community activity that happens and is fostered out of that space. So if we have something that we were to shut down a section of the deck, that would be a really big problem for our region. It's really important for us to pass these bonding bills so that we don't end up in a really bad position with some type of emergency that we have to address.
All right, so thank you for that question, viewer. Please keep writing in or calling in with questions about the bonding bill or any other issue you have. So the bonding bill was a known issue coming into the session. Just in the past week and a half, though, an unknown issue cropped up in the state Senate, and we had a few Republican lawmakers react to this last week. Want to give equal time to a Democrat today. State senator from the metro area was charged with a felony first-degree burglary attempt, and there's been some talk. There was an ethics investigation that is going to get started here next week on her. There's some calls for resignation, both informally and formally by the body, and how this interplays as well is there's a slim one-vote majority in the legislature. Now, there are also 6 other legislators, both Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate, that have been arrested and convicted of other charges, misdemeanor charges, everything from a DWI to an assault charge. And so, and there's nothing in state law that says that something needs to happen if a legislator is charged and or arrested. And so that's where we sit in the process. What are your thoughts and feelings about moving forward, what needs to happen?
It's a really tough situation. I mean, I think that it's really sad what has happened on a number of fronts, both for this legislator who has been charged, for their family, for just all of the things that they're going through and will be going through as a result of this. And we'll see as the process continues through the courts. We'll probably learn more information that we don't know right now, and is typical not to know when an initial criminal charge is brought. There's a lot of unanswered questions about the details of what is being alleged. And those details tend to come out through hearings, or if a case actually goes to a trial, they might come out in the trial. So it remains, there's a lot of unanswered questions right now. But I do think that it is important for us to move forward with our work at the legislature. This legislator in particular, a senator, represents just as many people as I do. I represent the Duluth area here in the Senate, and this colleague represents thousands of people as well. And they elected this person to serve and to cast their votes for them on their behalf at the Senate. So I do believe that particularly in the instance of there has been an allegation made, there have been charges filed, but there is a process, a democratic process that we have enshrined in our federal constitution and our state constitution for vetting out what the final call is on those allegations, whether or not those allegations are true, so whether someone is found not guilty or guilty, and then if they were to be found guilty, what the consequences should be in any particular circumstance. So that process has just begun, just barely begun. The charges were filed, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and now there's going to be, I think the first hearing in the case isn't until June, and our session will be done by then. Fingers crossed, we're going to be done by then. And that will continue on. That case will continue on, and the courts will grapple with it and deal with it with the processes that we have set out in our laws. And so I do think it is really important to draw the distinction between that initial phase where someone is presumed innocent, unless until they would be found guilty by a jury of their peers or decide to plead guilty to a charge. There's a difference between that phase, that is what we're in right now, and a phase where someone has actually either pled guilty or been found guilty in a court of law. So at this very early stage in this particular matter, I think it's important that we continue our work. We need to go forward. We need to finish the work that we were sent there to do. And in particular, with this close, as you mentioned, this close 34-33 in the Senate, it does present an opportunity, unfortunately, for the minority party to really try and hammer this issue very aggressively, which we saw over this past week, to really go at that colleague and try to make this a really big issue and force delays and force ultimately a resignation if that was what they wanted to seek. Because that could mean a change of the balance of power if they were successful. And it could mean a stop to the work that we're doing. So if you are somebody who doesn't want to see a lot of the bills that we're working on right now in the legislature, everything from our Health and Human Services to our judiciary bill, to our labor bill, to our transportation bill, housing bill, all of this work that we've been doing all session, if you're somebody who isn't in support of the measures that are moving forward, there is an incentive perhaps there to try to make this issue with the colleague in the courts into a big issue. But there's a lot of hypocrisy, I would say, over this last week that we've observed that has been really disheartening to see.
Do you think that's the only reason people are calling for a resignation, though, for political purposes? Or do you think there are some people who are principled saying, we've heard, and we've had a few Republican legislators sitting here saying, we heard the tape of the 911 phone call and those issues. And so are you saying it's purely politics and delay alone, or some folks just saying, a felony charge is a felony charge?
I think there's a couple different things at play. I do think that there are some colleagues who do have a genuine belief. I do not hold this belief, but they do have a genuine belief that if someone is charged with a felony, they've decided it's a felony, and people should know there are a whole spectrum of felonies out there. There's felony murder, and then there's felony, this particular felony where there's a charge, where there's a lot of extenuating circumstances, family members involved, a lot of context for the courts to take a look at. So some of them I do believe are coming from a very genuine place, but there certainly are a number of people who are coming at this from a very political orientation and trying to make this into something. But we haven't seen this approach toward as you mentioned, these other charges. We've had a number of colleagues in the legislature who have been accused of crimes. Some of them have pled guilty to crimes. Drunk driving in particular is a very dangerous offense where people could have been killed. That's an extremely dangerous thing to do, to drive drunk. But those colleagues were never come at in the way that this colleague now today is being attacked and vilified upon her being charged. So it does seem that there is certainly a double standard and a lot of hypocrisy that's happening right now at the legislature. I don't think it's all political, but I do think that there is a lot of politics involved. It is most certainly not all just genuine concern about somebody who's been charged with a felony voting on behalf of their constituents.
And as you said, her court case will be happening in June. The session will be over in 2 weeks. Yeah. There is a process in place already, an ethics committee that the Senate has that has equal number of Democrats and Republicans that serve.
That's correct.
And a hearing their first hearing on this issue will be happening on Tuesday, I believe.
That's correct. So that process is also beginning. And it's always a question when you have a charge brought, and then you also have the ethics process that's being carried forward within the legislative body, in this case the Senate. When you have that pending case going through the criminal courts, until that case is resolved, there's also a question of whether and what action should be taken within the Senate body. So we'll see what that bipartisan ethics committee decides to do with the case while it's pending. In the past, we have seen legislators remain, and some facing very serious charges in the courts, and remain continuing to do their legislative work through the course of their process taking place in the court. So we'll see. I'll be interested, and I'll be following that as well to see the things that they take into account in the ethics committee.
More to come on that issue, I'm sure, and more questions coming in as we speak.
Sure.
We have a question here about the state removing state tax on Social Security payments. We get this question almost weekly as well.
Yeah.
I know some work was done last year on this issue, but can you talk where we're at on the tax on Social Security for retirees in Minnesota?
Yes, this is a great question, and it's a question that my office gets a lot too from constituents and people throughout the state. We did this last year, as you said, do some work on that. We placed a cap of income that up to, I can't remember what it was, 120,000. There's a certain level of income that you can receive from Social Security. If you're below that, that won't be taxed in Minnesota.
The number I saw was 82% of Minnesotans do not pay a tax now after the change last year.
That sounds about right to me. Yeah. So now the remaining, the people who are still paying tax, state tax on their Social Security income, are those upper income earners. They're people who are making more money, and I think that is appropriate. I really do. I'm not somebody who supports completely taking away state tax for all Social Security income. I think that it is important for us to have upper income earners pay a fair share of the taxes that we need to pay for our public goods. And so those who are bringing in more money also need to give back a little bit more. And so I think the work that we did last year was a good compromise. I supported that, and I'll continue to support that to try to make sure that our tax burden is appropriately placed on the wealthy.
A counter argument to that I've heard is that we are in competition, especially with retirees moving to warmer climates, and many of those, Arizona, Florida, and others, do not tax it at any level. And so what do you think about that argument around competition of making sure we keep Minnesotans in Minnesota?
That's an interesting question. I think that the cost, or the cost to the state, and the benefit, also that like reverse benefit that a retiree would receive if they, for example, went to Florida, went to Arizona. I think that if we have a retiree, and we know many retirees out of Minnesota will end up going to warmer environs upon their retirement, at least seasonally. But I do think that there's just a lot more, there are many more important things for people to consider in where they're going to live in their retirement than a relatively small amount of state tax on their Social Security earnings, especially if they're making those higher incomes. People are going to stay here or leave depending on the kind of weather that they want to live in, where their kids are, where their grandkids are, what's going on in their lives. I don't think that amount of Social Security state tax income is really going to make that difference for that many people.
Keep those questions coming in, please. One of the other major issues this legislative session is around emergency medical services, especially in rural communities. We've seen issues around reimbursement rates from the federal government, and a real pinch in both workforce and the ability to provide these services all across the state. And so Governor Walz came out with a dollar amount that was well below what the legislature actually in a task force came up with, but it was a starting point for the conversation. First, more philosophically, primarily emergency medical services is a locally funded issue, along with fire and police and some of those protections. But there are folks in a bipartisan way supporting a stopgap measure to help out. So do you see this being a state responsibility or more of a local responsibility when it comes to EMS or emergency medical services?
I think it's absolutely a shared responsibility. Emergency medical services are something that we have rightfully come to depend on and expect that in today's society, that when you need help and you need this emergency service, that people will come. They will come to help you. It's a wonderful thing about our society. And it's one of those basic rights, I would argue, that we need to ensure, not just locally, but also at the state level, where we have a lot more resources, we have a lot more tools at the state level to be able to make sure that resources get to a local community to make sure that those needs are met. So, yeah, and I have heard a number of colleagues talking about this issue at the legislature. I am hopeful that we're going to be able to move forward with something here this year.
So coming from more of a regional center, is this impacting Duluth and its residents? And are you supportive of where the governor's at? Would you like to see more funding than he's proposed?
That's a great question. I have not received a lot of constituent contact about this issue in particular. I am aware of it as being more of a Northeast Minnesota regional issue, but my constituent area is the city of Duluth, and in the city of Duluth proper, I have not heard people bring this as an issue that they would like to see me working on. So this is something that some of my colleagues I know have put a lot of work into, and I remain supportive of that work and look forward to letting me know how I can best support them.
All right. So another big issue that's been on the plate and been debated in the Senate and soon to be in the House by some of the colleagues in the other body is gun control legislation.
Yeah.
And so really 3 pieces of legislation that have been debated and are moving forward in some way, shape, or form. And we'd like you to talk briefly as you can on all 3 of these issues. And so let's start with straw purchases. And this is, you can talk about what that issue is and if you support it and the likelihood of success of that legislation passing.
Sure. Well, I will say with all of these pieces of legislation that we're seeing move through this year, we'll see how it goes. These are all pieces of gun safety legislation that focus on individual behaviors. So with the straw purchase example, we're trying to close a loophole where people may be able to purchase certain firearms without going through an official process to make sure that they are fit to be able to own that type of weapon. So they
somebody buys it on their behalf.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a sort of runaround where somebody would, and we actually saw a case recently at the state level where, I think in the metro, where there was a tragedy and that had come out of a straw purchase where someone had somebody else had purchased that weapon, and then the person who ended up using it and hurting people with it had just gotten it secondhand from that person. So I guess we will see. I am hopeful, and I am generally supportive of these measures to try to create sort of more guardrails around ownership. But I do think, and I've told my colleagues this in caucus just the other day actually, is that at some point, the efficacy of going after individual people for violations of law around a straw purchase, for example, or how they store their weapon, whether or not that was done according to the law or responsibly, there's a limit to the efficacy of that. If we are truly serious about safety around weapons and how they are used in our society, we really have to look at the manufacturers of these weapons and how they are proliferating, how they are sold by large retailers, how they are available for purchase, which ones are available for purchase for the general public. Those are things that we have to really go after and look at. I know that I have some colleagues with legislation, and I also have some legislation that would look at treating, especially some of these weapons that have been involved in the mass shootings that we've seen for years now across the country, ever since Columbine when I was in college. that would treat those types of weapons more like we treat cars and licensure for vehicles and use of vehicles. So it would be licensed, you would be required to get insurance. There would be a sort of structure around who could own those very, very dangerous weapons that really are designed to inflict as much damage as possible in as short amount of time as possible. So we need to look at that. We need to look at whether or not we're going to allow certain types of weapons to be out in the public. We need to look at a buyback programs so that we're not just trying to solve this large societal issue by punishing individuals here and there. It's a big systems problem that we are dealing with in the United States and in Minnesota, where we have an outrageous number of weapons that are out in the public that have been pushed and sold by the industry, and that a segment of our population owns a disproportionate number of those weapons. And what we need to do is shift things so that we can take some of those very dangerous weapons out of the public. And I'm not describing some sort of forced confiscation of weapons, but what I am describing is incentivizing people to start exchanging them, to say, I mean, if somebody owns many of these very dangerous weapons, they may decide, do I really need these? At some point, they're going to want to not have them anymore. And if we can have a buyback program, if we can have different incentives to try to get those very dangerous weapons out of the hands of the public, and then we can also, for the ones that still remain in the public, have a system of licensure and a system of insurance so that people will be able to own those weapons more responsibly. So that's a long way of saying that I do support, and I am hopeful that these measures, including the straw purchases and the safety and
the reporting
are included. Those are important steps, but the efficacy of those, I believe, is going to be limited. At the end of the day, we really do have to look at the industry. We have to look at the system as a whole and find out better ways to create safety.
And as you said, that'll be a longer-term conversation.
That is a longer-term
conversation.
Yes.
We'll get a lot more feedback on both ways there, but I want to focus on these three, just if I could, because we're talking about this session. So we talked about straw purchases. There's also a gun storage bill that's in place. Can you briefly explain what that legislation would do?
So I have to see what the latest is. I know that there have been negotiations happening with the bill's lead author in the Senate. Senator Gustafson is carrying that bill with some of the constituencies and stakeholders who were opposed to it last year. It didn't make it across the finish last year because there were some concerns about the way that the bill was written, and they wanted to see some changes being made. So I think that there are some changes that are being worked in, and I really can't speak to those because I haven't been working on that bill specifically. But I know that my colleague and a number of people are working on that to try to hammer out agreement between stakeholders, and are very hopeful that we'll be able to move a sort of compromise through.
And it's very natural.
It's really about, it is what it sounds like. It's a safe storage requirement, that the way that people are storing their weapons, it needs to have a certain requirement around what that looks like and how they would be stored.
All right. And then the last one we're talking about is a mandatory reporting if a gun is stolen from you or taken from you, and you would have 48 hours to report this.
Right.
The biggest issue I heard in this debate is, folks are what-ifing the scenario. So what if you were assaulted and your firearm was stolen from you, and maybe you're in a hospital, and so is it arbitrary to say 48 hours? Is that good public policy? Can you talk a bit about that requirement? Yeah,
I mean, as a former public defender myself and somebody who is really concerned with civil liberties issues, I certainly will be taking a close look at the language to make sure that there are sort of extenuating circumstances built in so that there wouldn't end up being a bizarre situation where somebody was assaulted and in a hospital or those types of things. Excuse me. But I do think, again, it goes to, you can make a requirement, whether that's 48 hours, 72 hours a week, whatever that would be, to report a stolen weapon. But I do have concerns with turning our law enforcement against individual people for an infraction in the way that they handle their weapon, even in the way that they store a weapon, in the way that whether they report a stolen weapon or not. Like there's a limit. There's going to be placing those requirements on somebody in those situations. Just making sure that the law is not so rigid that it's not going to allow for very normal sort of reactions that people might have if their weapon was stolen in the way that they store their weapons. Is that information going to get to them? So I do think it is really important the way that we approach these laws that are focused on individual behavior versus systems behavior.
Okay. Sounds like work to be done on this issue.
We'll keep an eye on it. We'll take and I think I'm not the only senator who's really going to be taking a close look at the language. This has been a big issue for a lot of people.
All right. Well, please keep those questions and comments coming to us. We've got another viewer, and we're going to change gears a bit here. Actually, the state is celebrating its anniversary, and part of that is a brand new flag for the state of Minnesota. And so this viewer is asking, why can't all Minnesotans vote on the new flag design? And I saw that you're wearing, I believe, the flag.
Well,
that's
actually,
the Duluth flag right there.
This is the Duluth flag.
Yes, but
I get a lot of questions about this. That is this like a flag that was submitted but not chosen? But no, this is the Duluth flag.
Yeah. So Minnesota has a new flag. A committee got put together, got input, and brought that forward. I know there was some conversation about the legislature weighing in on this, and a viewer here in the region wants to know why can't all Minnesotans vote on this new flag design?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way that the law was set up last year and passed was that the commission that came together, which was made up of various stakeholders, would come up with and consult with flag experts and design experts, and then come up with a plan and then decide on a flag, and that if that unless the legislature took action that year, that would become the flag. And I haven't received a lot of people saying, we really, really want to vote on this thing, on whether or not we change our flag. I think that the consensus of a lot of people that I have heard is that people really are ready to change the flag. The last session when we passed the law to create this commission that created the flag, I did hear from a number of constituents about wanting to see the flag changed, both for aesthetic reasons and for cultural, historical reasons, that we have moved on, and that flag, the flag that we have had, really no longer represents who we are as a people, how we want to see ourselves going forward into the future, and we wanted to see a flag that would be a better representation of who we are and who we want to be going forward. So I feel pretty comfortable with it, with the process. I don't necessarily think we need to have a big old have it out and have a big fight over whether we change the flag or not. I think that that decision really was made when we passed the law last year, that we were ready for the new flag.
And it sounds like the new flag will be official here on the state's birthday, which is later this week.
Yeah, we're really excited about it. And I think that as the rollout happened, we saw some various reactions to it, but I think that it's growing on a lot of people as we start to get used to it more and more and start to recognize it and see it out there. And it's really nice. I'm excited about the change.
We get a question every week about the Equal Rights Amendment.
Yes.
And so we're going to talk about that for a bit, and this would be a question that would be put on the ballot for folks to decide if we're going to enshrine in our Constitution equal rights.
Yes.
And the Senate has already put together a list of what that would look like, and I'll run through them for you if you don't mind.
No,
race, color, creed, national origin, ancestry, disability, sexual orientation, sexual identity, and now the House has a different provision, and so the big difference between the two is the Senate has creed in what they would want to put on the ballot, and the House has matters relating to one's own pregnancy or decision whether to become or remain pregnant. And so constitutional amendment to enshrine equal rights for all of these issues and or identities of Minnesotans. Where do you stand overall on a constitutional amendment? And then we can get in the weeds on what you think the final list should be if you support it.
I am a big supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment, and I think it is one of these issues that I wish would have passed and been taken care of before my time. It would have been nice to have the Equal Rights Amendment in place when I was growing up in Duluth in the 80s and 90s, and so it is sort of strange to find myself as a state senator considering this right now in 2024. But so I think it's long overdue. I think we need to pass it. I am ready to vote yes on it as soon as it comes to the floor, as soon as we're ready to pass that final version. So I do think that there's some question, and we can talk about the details of when it would be on the ballot. There's some discussion about whether it would, some people are asking whether it could be on the ballot for this session. I think that some other people want to see it next year, or in the next years to come. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm a huge supporter of it and would love to see it passed into law. And I'm actually, this is a question that I have for my caucus and my leadership, that there's just so many things happening right now. I don't think that I've heard back yet on the latest status of the Equal Rights Amendment and what our plans are for passing it. But this is a huge priority for Duluthians. I get a ton of correspondence from constituents about the Equal Rights Amendment and wanting us to see it passed, and I do too.
And as you said, growing up, and I think we're around the same vintage, it was primarily equal rights among men and women at that time. Right. And now as I read this list, it's a very long list. Yep. And the difference now is, as I said, creed was included in a Senate version that's already in discussion. And issues relating to abortion are on the other list. And so from the 1970s forward here, we've added a lot of potential possibilities. Where are you at on what should be included here? Are you supportive of all of these categories? As I said, abortion is in the House side. Yeah. You all have creed, or I'm guessing religion was probably something that was considered there. Right. Where are you at in how inclusive this list should be?
I think that the list should be as inclusive as possible. I think that our society has changed for the better since the 70s, when initially we were talking about an Equal Rights Amendment, where that was imagining women being equal to men in standing in society. Now we have much more expansive views that are broadly accepted, widely accepted around sexual orientation, around identity, around wanting to see that sense of equality and guarantees for equal rights under the law extended to everybody, really, truly everybody. And I think that we shouldn't now, in 2024, be trying to pass an Equal Rights Amendment for 1974, or whenever that initial effort began. We should be trying to pass an Equal Rights Amendment that is meaningful to our lives today, our ethical and moral foundation that we have today versus 1970s. So I'm very supportive of having it be very expansive. It absolutely has to include equal rights for our LGBTQ and trans siblings, and not exclude them. And I especially with our politics, the way that things are right now, there's actually a concerted effort amongst some in the right of our politics to use transgender people in our society, in our communities, to use them as political pawns and to erase who they are, and to try to not talk about who they are, their existence, or the issues that they face. And I just think it's very, very important for us to reaffirm the humanity of everybody in our society, including transgender community members, and to make sure that they're protected, specifically in our day and age when they are being specifically targeted in a very cruel, awful way.
And we don't know if this will actually get on the ballot, and there's even a question if it'll be this year or 2 years from now.
Correct.
So more to come on this issue.
Correct.
What we've got, just as you have more bonding requests than funding, we have more questions and probably time left.
Good.
We're going to stay in the election area, and a viewer is calling in asking, How can we ensure fair elections when 86,000 immigrants are being granted driver's licenses who are not citizens? And so, do you know that issue or have an answer to that question? Because I know that I believe I remember gave the authority for immigrants or
to have driver's
non-documented to have
license.
driver's licenses.
Yep.
And they're asking about if there's a connection between that and the ability to vote.
Voting?
Yes.
So people should realize, to make sure that people know, it is not legal for somebody to come and vote if they are not a United States citizen. That is illegal. That is a crime that carries punishments, I think, of jail time and all sorts of trouble for somebody if they were to try to do that. And people have been brought up on charges in other places in the country, I know, for trying to do similar things. But this is an issue that I think is actually something that has been drummed up unnecessarily. We've never heard any evidence of that type of voter fraud in Minnesota, where you have an immigrant who is not a citizen yet, and they present themselves at a polling location or try to cast a ballot in an election as if they were a U.S. citizen. I'm not aware of any instances like that happening at all. And the other issue for people to know is that when you go up to your polling place and you actually cast your ballot, we don't in Minnesota require you to show your driver's license or your ID. You do have to present some information when you initially register, but after that, when you're a registered voter, you just go and you just vote. You sign, you sign off on your signature that it's you. So we have an excellent system in Minnesota, making sure that people who do not have documentation are also able to have a driver's license. I do not think that is going to change anything in the realm of voting at all. Whether they have a driver's license or not, they're not able to present that driver's license as evidence of being a United States citizen. So it remains illegal for somebody to vote who is not a United States citizen. And I think that this fear that has been drummed up again by the right and by Trump, former President Trump, who is now seeking another term as president, this sort of anti-immigrant sentiment that somehow there's this invasion of people coming from other places who are coming to try to take over our society or vote in our elections even though they're not citizens. And that's nonsense. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. And in fact, the people who come to our society to try to find work and to try to support their families and try to live their lives, they're just, the grand majority of them are just working hard, trying to do the best that they can. And I think that it's very disheartening for me sometimes to hear some of the rhetoric, the anti-immigrant rhetoric that is coming really from the mainstream of the Republican Party today. It just foments a lot of hate, it foments a lot of distrust, and it's really unwarranted. There's absolutely no evidence that any of these sort of fears that the right wing is bringing to the public have any bearing in reality. It's just not happening. In particular, I would note too that I find it particularly disturbing that here in northern Minnesota, right up close to Canada, we have in some quarters this sort of fixation on people coming from the southern border. It's so nonsensical and so not grounded in any sense of reality. I really want to appeal to people to look to try to be their better selves around this and to try to put themselves in other people's shoes and imagine what they would do if they were living in a country where they could not find the resources to support their family or themselves, and they literally needed to leave to live, and ask themselves how they would want to be treated by other people. So I would love to see more humanity in these discussions and better treatment toward our fellow people. There's a lot of people living in Minnesota, working, paying taxes, participating fully in society, had their kids here, raising their kids here, who, when they came, didn't have the paperwork that they needed to legitimately come here. They are still members of our community. They should still be treated with humanity. They should still not be treated as other and suspect that they're somehow going to try to vote when they're not allowed to vote. I mean, let's treat people better and with humanity.
I'm going to change gears a bit here. We saw some progress made on what is called junk fees. And so that is for viewers back home, this probably impacts most of the folks watching the show tonight. When you go somewhere and you pay your bill and there's a whole bunch of surcharges that pop up after your purchase, they call that junk fees. What, if anything, is happening on that issue? It sounds like there's some progress being made on it.
There is some progress being made. We just passed a bill off the Senate floor this past week in regard to junk fees. And this is a great consumer protection measure where, as you said, you go out to eat or you make a purchase, and all of a sudden the final bill is creeping up in amount and was not actually, you were not told what that final amount was going to be before you're actually just presented with the bill. So really the bill, as I understand it, requires disclosure of those fees so that people just know what they're getting into. And in particular, we're talking about like DoorDash or some of the delivery services that exist out there today, making sure that people know up front what they're talking about if they're going to actually pay for this service, what it is that what is the amount that they're going to be paying, what's that final piece. So it's just disclosure, just giving people the information that they need to make their purchasing decisions.
Education is another important topic always at the Capitol. It's not a budget year, but an education funding bill is making its way through the process with an additional $31 million, making it available to pay teachers outside of the classroom so that they can learn better ways to teach children how to read. And so when some of your Republican colleagues were here in weeks past, they talked about a large funding increase for education last year, but so much of it, in their words, saying tied to mandates, saying you can get this funding for specific things. And we're seeing a number of proposed layoffs at many of the school districts in northeastern Minnesota, Grand Rapids in particular, seeing a significant layoff of teachers. So can you talk specifically maybe about this funding area and this charge that much of the funding last year, this historic amount of funding, was tied to mandates or specific ways to spend that money?
Well, I will say that we passed a record amount of spending for our public education last year, and we're really proud of that. I think that a lot of the allegations of there being these mandates that were not funded adequately are either flat out wrong or they're being way overblown. The districts do have a lot of flexibility in the way that they can use the funds that are sent to them. And there's a lot of things that come into play if we're talking about what's happening in Grand Rapids or some of the other school districts in the state where they're making decisions about spending or decisions about whether or not they're going to have to do some layoffs. There's a lot of different factors that come into play, not just the money that was sent in record amount from the state last year and what sort of requirements might be tied to the funding that those districts have received. We've also seen just, I think, a lot of, and I'm the chair of the Senate Labor Committee, so that's labor is really my space, my wheelhouse, and we've had a lot of work looking at workers throughout the state, not just in education with teachers or hourly paid school workers, but workers throughout various sectors in Minnesota. And I think that in the space of our school districts, we have seen a lot of shifts and changes as we have come out of the pandemic and everything that entailed, and the school districts dealing with the changes that had to occur during the pandemic and then post-pandemic, and now workers also really wanting to be treated with dignity and to receive wages that they can support their families on, where they can thrive in our society. And so we're seeing a lot of shifting right now. And in terms of those claims, I think they're not warranted. But we'll see. I'd love to have as much resources as we can for our public schools, and we'll keep working on that.
All right, we have just a minute left, and I apologize to all the viewers. We got so many questions, but wanted to end on somewhat of a high bipartisan note. This last week, legislation was passed honoring former state representative and state senator Dave Tomassoni from our region, hometown Chisholm, and dedicating a portion of Highway 169 in his honor. And he was showered with praise. Like I said, bipartisan. I know you served with him briefly, but do you have any recollections of serving with Senator Tomassoni?
I do. I didn't really get to know Senator Tomassoni very well. My time when I came into the Senate, Senator Tomassoni, along with Senator Bach, had switched caucuses, so they'd been caucusing with the Republican caucus, and I didn't have a lot of time to really talk with him very much or get to know him very much. I do recall the first time I met him was up at the Virginia courthouse when I was working as an attorney. Someone had introduced me to him, and I for the first time, and that is the first time that I met him. But I know that a lot of our colleagues at the Senate have a lot of memories around him and his work, and so yes, as you said, that was an occasion of bipartisanship where we dedicated a stretch of the highway in his name.
And somebody, fellow from Chisholm, that parcel of 169, I hope you included in that legislation that there will be no potholes on that highway to the best extent possible, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
Alrighty. Well, we are out of time, and I'd like to thank Senator McEwen for joining us here this evening, answering questions and sharing her thoughts. We will be back again next Sunday at 5 to speak with more members of the Minnesota State Legislature and answer more of your questions. Thank you for watching, and to the viewers at home for calling and writing in with your questions. You're playing a vital part in our representative government. For the team here at PBS North, I'm Tony Sertich. Have a great evening.